The rain had been falling since early evening, a slow and steady curtain of silver that turned the streets into rivers of light. Neon signs and street lamps blurred in its reflection, creating pools of gold and crimson on the slick cobblestones. The city had been swallowed by the sound, the soft, endlessness of water against stone, roofs, and glass, and walking through it felt like moving through a dream. I had ducked into the old library cafe for warmth, shaking the rain from my coat and brushing droplets from my hair. It was the kind of place you could walk past 100 times without noticing, an unassuming wooden door, a faded brass handle, and a sign so worn you could barely read the name. Inside, however, was a different world, a world that smelled of old paper, freshly ground coffee, and rain-soaked wool. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, their uneven rows stacked with novels, poetry, and histories whose pages had yellowed over decades. Heavy curtains framed the large front window, where candlelight met the night outside. Small tables were scattered around the room, each topped with a brass candlestick, its flame flickering in the draught whenever someone opened the door. And there she was. She stood by the window, a leather-bound book cradled in her hands. Her coat hung over the back of a chair, revealing a fitted sweater the color of deep wine. Her hair was still damp, curling slightly at the ends, and the way the candlelight caught in it made it look almost like a halo. She didn't notice me at first. Her eyes were on the page, her lips moving just slightly as though she were reading to herself. For a moment, I just watched her. Something about the way she occupied the space felt deliberate, as if she belonged to it entirely. I ordered a coffee, mostly as an excuse to linger, and walked slowly toward her table. She glanced up when I was still a few steps away, and for the briefest second, our eyes met. It wasn't a glance. It was a lock, and it held me there, suspended. "You always read by the window?" I asked when I reached her, my voice low enough to be a question meant only for her. Her smile was small, but it carried a spark. "Only when I'm waiting for someone." It was the kind of answer that could have been playful or dangerous. I wasn't sure which. I sat across from her, the tiny round table between us suddenly feeling too small to be a barrier. The book in her hands was an old copy of the collected poems of Pablo Neruda. She let me see the page she was on, something about love, about the weight of silence. "You like poetry?" I asked. "I like anything that makes you feel more than you're ready to," she said, her eyes holding mine for a beat too long. That was the beginning. We talked. Not about the weather, not about the news, but about books that had changed us, about the first time each of us had been truly alone in a foreign city, about the way rain made time feel slower. She told me she used to write letters she never sent, just to feel the weight of words on paper. I told her I kept a leather journal, but only wrote in it when I couldn't sleep. The cafe was warm, the storm outside relentless. The faint hum of a piano drifted from a small speaker in the corner, soft enough that we had to lean slightly forward to hear each other. Every time she did, I caught the scent of her perfume, something light floral, but grounded with warmth. An hour passed, then another. The rain deepened, and the streets outside emptied. People came and went, but she and I remained, caught in a bubble of candlelight and quiet voices. At one point, she reached for her coffee at the same time I did for mine, our hands brushing. It was nothing, but it wasn't nothing. The touch lingered in my skin like a faint burn. Her eyes flicked up to mine, and something shifted there, not a smile, not a laugh, but something slower, heavier. The cafe owner eventually began dimming lights near the counter. It was late. I hadn't even noticed. She closed her book, running her fingers along the edge of the leather cover as though it were something precious. "Looks like they're closing," I said, reluctant to stand. She glanced at the rain outside, then back at me. "I'm not in a hurry," she said softly. Neither was I. We stepped out together, the bell over the cafe door chiming gently. The rain had eased into a mist, wrapping the city in a haze that blurred its edges. We walked without deciding where to go, our steps falling in sync. And though we spoke little on that walk, it felt as if every quiet second was threaded with something alive, something just beginning to take shape. I didn't know then that the night wouldn't end for hours. I didn't know how the rain would become only a backdrop to what followed. All I knew was that with each step, the world around us faded, until there was only her, and the sound of her voice when she finally said my name. The city at night felt different with her beside me. The rain had softened to a fine mist, the kind that clung to your skin and hair, making everything glisten under the street lamps. Each step we took seemed to carry us further away from everything familiar, as though we were slipping into a quieter, more hidden version of the world. We didn't talk much at first. Our silence wasn't empty. It was charged, full of awareness. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing over the hush of the rain, could feel the warmth of her presence beside me even without touching. The cobblestones gleamed like dark glass beneath our shoes, and the reflection of the gaslight stretched long and golden across the street. After a while, she tilted her head slightly toward me. "Do you ever notice," she said softly, "how some nights feel, as if they're meant to be kept secret?" I smiled, though I wasn't sure she could see it in the dim light, like they only exist for the people who live them. She glanced at me with that half-smile again. "Exactly." We passed under an old stone archway, its surface damp and moss-covered, leading into a narrower street where the houses leaned inward as though they were whispering to each other. I could smell the faint sweetness of wet wood and chimney smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a violin played, the notes wandering, hesitant, like they, too, were searching for something. We stopped when we reached a small square. A fountain stood at its center, water spilling over its edges in the dim moonlight. The place was deserted. The shop windows shuttered, the air cool but not cold. She stepped toward the fountain and rested her hand on its wet stone edge, looking down at the ripples. I joined her, leaning slightly so that my shoulder almost touched hers. It was such a small distance, and yet I felt the pull of it, the way you might feel the heat of a fire before you even see the flames. "You don't seem afraid of the night," I said quietly. She looked up at me, the corner of her mouth curving. "I'm not afraid when I'm with someone who makes it feel alive." Her words lingered in the air between us, making the space feel suddenly smaller. I could see the way the mist had caught in her hair, the faint shimmer on her lashes. My instinct was to step closer, to bridge the remaining inches between us. But instead, I waited, watching the way her eyes shifted, deepened. We wandered again, our pace slower now, as though neither of us wanted to find an ending. At one point, our hands brushed, and this time neither of us pulled away. Her fingers found mine, tentative at first, then certain, fitting into the spaces between them, as though they had been meant to. It wasn't just a touch. It was the way she looked at me then, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had been expecting this from the moment I walked into the cafe. We turned down another narrow street, where an old inn stood with its door slightly ajar and warm light spilling onto the stones outside. Inside, a fire crackled in a low hearth, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with something sweet, cinnamon, maybe. She glanced at it, then at me, her brows lifting just slightly, as though asking a question without words. "Should we?" I asked. Her answer was a quiet, certain nod. The inn's common room was nearly empty. A few travelers sat in the far corner, speaking in low voices. We found a small table near the fire. The flames painted her face in shades of gold and shadow, and every time she moved, the light shifted over her skin, as though it were touching her with deliberate care. We ordered mulled wine, its spice warmth curling into the air between us. We talked in softer voices now, our words almost blending with the crackle of the fire. And each time she leaned in, whether to hear me better or to let her own words fall nearer, her closeness felt like a question I wanted to answer. When the innkeeper came by with another log for fire, I noticed her watching the flames as though they were speaking to her. Her hand rested on the table, close enough that my own could cover it without much movement. I hesitated, then did. Her fingers tightened around mine. No smile this time, only that deep, steady gaze that seemed to hold both challenge and invitation. The rest of the world was gone again. The rain had stopped by the time we finished our wine, but the world outside felt even quieter than before. The few patrons in the inn had drifted upstairs, and the fire in the hearth burned low, sending occasional sparks into the dim air. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady on mine. There was no more hesitation in it now, only the unspoken acknowledgement that whatever this night was, we were both stepping deeper into it. When the innkeeper passed by again, she asked softly, "Are there rooms?" His answer was a nod, his voice low. "Up the stairs, second door on the left." We climbed the narrow wooden steps together, the sound of our footsteps muffled on the old boards. The hall was lit only by a single candle in a wall sconce, its flame swaying gently with the draught. At the second door, she paused, glancing at me before pushing it open. The room was small but warm. A heavy four-poster bed draped with faded velvet curtains, a small table with another candle burning low, and a single window showing the wet glimmer of the street below. The faint scent of lavender hung in the air, mixed with a lingering trace of wood smoke from the hearth downstairs. She moved first, crossing the room to the window and resting her hands on the sill. I closed the door behind us, the sound of the latch clicking somehow louder than it should have been. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She turned slowly, leaning against a window frame, the candlelight catching the curve of her cheek, the loose strands of hair that framed her face. Her gown shifted with her movement, revealing the pale line of her collarbone. "You don't seem like someone who does this often," I said quietly. Her lips curved faintly. "And you seem like someone who notices too much." I took a step closer, then another, until there was barely a breath of space between us. My hand lifted, not quite touching, just hovering near her cheek, feeling the warmth radiating from her skin. Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, and in that moment, everything in the room seemed to slow. She reached up, her fingers brushing mine, guiding my hand to her face. The simple contact sent a rush through me, not because of where it was, but because of what it meant, a deliberate choice, an invitation without words. We moved as though drawn by something neither of us had planned. The candlelight danced over her eyes, over the faint smile that softened and deepened at the same time. My other hand found hers, fingers intertwining, holding her there, as though letting go might end the spell. The outside world had truly ceased to exist now. There was only the sound of our breathing, the soft rustle of fabric, the muted glow that wrapped us in its own private warmth. She whispered something then, not loud enough to be a sentence, just a thread of sound meant only for me. Whatever it was, I didn't need to understand it. The meaning was in her voice, in the way she leaned into me, in the way the night folded itself tighter around us. The inn was almost silent now. Downstairs, the last traces of tavern laughter had faded into muffled echoes, and the fire in the great hearth was no more than a dull glow, its embers sighing softly in the dark. Up here, in the narrow room tucked under the sloping roof, the air felt warmer, closer, as though the walls themselves leaned in, keeping our secret. A single candle burned on the small round table between us, its flame bending every so often when the faintest breath of night slipped in through the warped window frame. The light reached out in trembling gold, catching on the curve of her cheek, the pale silk of her gown, the loose fall of her hair that brushed over one shoulder like a whisper. I had been looking at her too long, but she didn't turn away. Her eyes held me, steady, unblinking, as though she could see not only my face, but the thoughts beneath it, the ones I dared not speak. There was a faint warmth to her gaze, but something sharper too, an unspoken challenge. Will you come closer? I did. My boots sounded softly on the old wooden floor, each creak of the board a reminder of how quiet the room had become. When I was close enough to reach her, I didn't, not yet. Instead, I stood there, letting the space between us tighten until it felt almost like touch. The candle scent, warm wax and faint smoke, mingled with hers, something soft and elusive that made the air itself feel heavier. She shifted her weight slightly, the silk of her gown whispering against itself, the movement so slight it was almost imagined. But my eyes caught it and lingered, her lips parted just a little, as though she might speak. She didn't. Instead, her gaze flickered down for an instant, tore my hands at my sides, then returned to my face. It was a glance that said everything. Slowly, I lifted one hand and extended it toward her. She didn't pull back. Our fingers touched, the barest contact, enough to feel the soft warmth of her skin against mine. And in that simple touch, the room seemed to tilt. The candle's light flickered, catching the glint of her hair, the faint sheen where silk met skin. The world outside the window, the wet cobblestone, the darkened houses, the drifting mist, became no more real than a painting. All I saw, all I felt, was her. Her hand turned in mine, fingers curling slightly until our palms met. I closed mine around hers, gently but with a quiet certainty that I wouldn't let go. "You're very quiet," I murmured, my voice low. "So are you," she replied softly, and for a moment there was the faintest smile at the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile that held both mischief and invitation. I let my thumb trace slowly across the back of her hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath, the warmth of her skin. My other hand rose, almost of its own will, to touch her face. I brushed my knuckles along her cheek, feeling the faint catch of her breath at the contact. Her eyes closed briefly, not in retreat, but in surrender, a trust that made the moment ache with its own kind of sweetness. "You feel," I began, but the words trailed off. I wasn't sure I could finish the sentence without breaking the spell. She opened her eyes again and looked directly into mine. "Then don't say it," she whispered. I let my hand slide gently to her jaw, my thumb resting just below her lips. Her breath warmed my fingers, and for a heartbeat, we simply stayed like that, close enough to feel the steady rhythm of each other's breathing, close enough for candlelight to paint us in the same pool of gold. Outside, somewhere far away, the wind rattled a shutter. The sound barely touched us. "You know," she said quietly, "if the world ended tonight, I think we'd be the last to notice." A faint laugh escaped me, soft, almost soundless. "It already has." Her gaze didn't leave mine as she stepped forward, erasing the last trace of distance between us. The fabric of her gown brushed against my coat, the warmth of her body now something I could feel fully, not just imagine. For a moment, time stopped, not the heavy stillness of waiting, but the breathless pause of something inevitable. My heart beat faster, not in a rush, but in the deep, steady rhythm of knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. I leaned in until our foreheads touched, her lashes lowering, her breath mingling with mine. We stayed like that, suspended in a quiet too fragile to break. The candle was burning low, the wax pooling at its base in uneven rivers. Shadows climbed the walls, slipping into corners like quiet conspirators, as though even the room itself understood the weight of what was unfolding within it. We stood so close now that every small movement felt like an unspoken vow. The lift of her breath, the slight turn of her wrist in my hand, the brush of silk against wool. The air was warm, and not only from the fire downstairs. It was a kind of warmth that wrapped itself around you, that made leaving feel impossible. Outside, a light rain began to fall, the sound tapping softly against the warped glass of the window. It was a distant, soothing rhythm, like the slow beating of a heart far away from ours. I had the strange feeling that we had been here forever, though in truth, only a few hours had passed since we'd first stepped into this little room. Yet in those hours, something had shifted, something irreversible. The world beyond the door, the muddy street, the faceless travelers, the cold wind, belonged to another life entirely. Her gaze lingered on me in the quiet. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. There was no question left unanswered between us now. Slowly, I lifted my hand and let my fingers drift over the curve of her shoulder, feeling the heat of her skin beneath the thin barrier of silk. Her eyes half closed, lashes catching the candlelight. "Stay," I said, though it came out as more of a plea than a command. Her lips curved faintly, a smile meant for me alone. I wasn't planning to leave. The tension between us was no longer fragile. It had become something steady, inevitable, like a tide that always returns to shore. I stepped closer, my other hand coming to rest at her waist. Her fingers found the edge of my coat, gathering the fabric lightly as though testing the weight of the moment. We stood in silence, listening only to the rain and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere far down the hall. It struck me then. This was not the sort of night one could carry into the morning without it being changed. It would either be remembered forever, sealed in the soft glow of memory, or it would fade, like a dream you wake from too soon. I intended it to be the first. We moved together without words, as though guided by some shared rhythm. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one shortening the space between us until there was no space at all. The heat of her body seeped into mine, the scent of her hair, faint rose water and something warmer, filled my head until there was nothing else. I touched her cheek, my thumb brushing just under her eye. She leaned into the touch with a sigh, so soft it could have been mistaken for the sound of the rain. "Everything feels different tonight," she whispered. "That's because it is." Her laugh, quiet, low, stirred something deep inside me. She didn't pull away when my hand slid to the back of her neck, fingers tangling lightly in the loose strands of her hair. Her eyes searched mine, as if to be certain of what she saw there. "You're certain?" she asked, though her tone carried more hope than doubt. "More certain than I've ever been." For a moment, we simply stood like that, suspended in the golden light, the rain's lullaby wrapping around us. Then, almost imperceptibly, we began to move toward the bed. It was not a hurried thing. Each step was a lingering exchange, every touch deliberate, as though we both understood this night would become the measure by which all others were judged. Her hand trailed along my arm, her fingers finding mine again, holding them as though they were something precious. We reached the bed, the heavy velvet canopy framing the space in shadow and gold. I turned to face her fully, my hands resting lightly at her waist. The candle flickered, as though uncertain whether to burn brighter or give itself to the dark. "You know," she murmured, "when I met you, I didn't think," she trailed off, shaking her head with a smile that carried both disbelief and joy. "That we'd end up here?" I finished for her. "That I'd want to—" The softness of her admission settled over us like a warm cloak. I reached up and let my fingers slide slowly down the length of her arm, marveling at the quiet power of such a simple gesture. She leaned closer, and our foreheads touched once more, a mirror of the earlier moment, yet heavier now with all that had passed between. Her breath warmed my lips, and for a heartbeat, neither of us moved. And then the world truly did fall away. We sank into the night as though it belonged only to us, the hours slipping past unnoticed. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the window. The candle burned lower still, and somewhere far below, the last ember in the tavern's hearth gave up its glow. But in here, warmth and light remained, tangled between us, woven into the very air. When at last her head came to rest against my chest, her breathing slow and steady, I knew that the night had done what it came to do. It had stopped time, and until morning found us, if it dared to, we would remain exactly as we were, two souls who, for a few perfect hours, have forgotten the rest of the world entirely,